Welcome to a three-part series on Megilas Rus in honor of the Yom Tov of Shavuos. I'm going to try to divide this series of shiurim into three parts of 15 minutes each, an average of 15 insights per shiur, giving a total of 45, which is a special number for me this year, of insights into Megilas Rus. I'll include Be'ezras Hashem all of the Mara Mekaymas, all the sources in the footnotes. Number one. According to Rashi, in Divrei Hayomim, at the beginning of Divrei Hayomim, Boaz is 300 years old when he marries Rus, and together they father a son named Ovid. It is, according to Rashi, the reason why when in describing the relationship between the two, the pasuk said in the end of Rus, Vayitan lo Hashem heroyin, that Hashem made Rus pregnant to acknowledge the miracle that Boaz was 300 years old at the time. Number two, Rus is 40 during the time of Megilas Rus when she marries Boaz. That means there's a 260-year difference between Boaz and Rus. But Rus has arichas yamim. She's blessed with long life. She merits to sit next to the throne of her great-great-grandson, Shlomo HaMelech, who placed the throne specially for her next to him as he sat in judgment over the Jewish people, which means that Rus lives till at least 170 years old. Number three, Rus and Boaz, in that this famous story of the two of them, are married for only a couple of hours. They get married on the 16th day of Tammuz, according to the Chasam Sofer, and that night, on the 17th of Tammuz, Boaz passes. Number four, the Chasam Sofer adds that this is the reason why Naomi tells Rus to go to Boaz in the middle of the night in the field, and Rus, of course, concedes and does exactly so, and literally lies down next to him in the middle of the field in the middle of the night. It's the most puzzling part of the whole story of Rus. Why would they do it that way? Why would they think that that was a good idea? Well, because they knew prophetically that Boaz didn't have much time. He was 300 years old. They thought that that was his last night, so it was an imloi achshav emasai scenario, where it was now or never. Boaz, in fact, does have another 24 hours to live after that, during which he properly gets married to Rus, and they end up fathering a child called Ovid. The simple understanding of Megilas Rus is that it begins that the man the Torah tells us about in the beginning, called Elimelech, was a terrible person. Despite him being wealthy and being in position of responsibility for Klal Yisrael, he turned his back on the Jews when they were in a moment of great crisis, when there was great hunger, ran away to Moav, and just abandoned the Jews in their hour of pain and need. That's the simple understanding. And yet, the Balaturim forces us to take a deeper look at who really Elimelech was and what his motivation was. The Balaturim is actually in the beginning of Chumash Shmos, when the Torah describes how Moshe Rabbeinu's father Amram marries Moshe Rabbeinu's mother Yocheved, and they have the son Moshe. The pasuk begins with the words Vayelech Ishmi Beis Levi, that Moshe Rabbeinu's father goes and marries Yocheved. The Torah uses the expression Vayelech Ish. Says the Balaturim, the words Vayelech Ish appear only two places in all of Tanakh. One by Amram, and one by Elimelech in the opening pasuk of Rus. Vahi b'mei shvoit hashoftim, the Torah says it was in the days of the judges. Vahi rov b'ortim, where there was a hunger. Vayelech ish mi Beis Lechem Yehuda, and a man went from Beis Lechem. This is referring to Elimelech, and here again the Torah uses the expression Vayelech ish. The connection between the two, says the Balaturim, is simple. Through Vayelech ish in Shmois, Moshe Rabbeinu the Goyal Rishon is born, and through Vayelech ish in beginning of Rus, David, Shloima, and eventually Melech HaMashiach are born, the Goyal Achrei. That's why the Torah uses the same expression. The fact that the Balaturim compares the two is astounding. Amram is a Godel Adoyer, and Elimelech is a terrible Rosha, who's cursed by Hashem, by his own demise, and the death of his own two sons, and the death of an unborn baby, and even according to the Medrash, the death of daughters. What's the connection between the two? Point 6, the commentaries argue that perhaps we need a paradigm shift in our understanding of Elimelech. Perhaps Elimelech had kavanah l'shem shamayim. He meant it for the sake of heaven. How could he possibly have meant it l'shem shamayim? Well, think, say the commentaries. Elimelech himself, a grandson of Nachshon ben Aminadav, came from the tribe of Yehuda. His name, Elimelech, Eli Melech, indicates that he knew he was destined to facilitate kings for the Jewish people. Perhaps he went to Moav because Rus and Orpah's father was a man named Eglon Melech Moav. Eglon Melech Moav, we know from a previous story in Tanakh, it had already been decreed upon him that he was going to be the ancestor of kings for the Jews. This was because when a shofet called Ehud went to give him a message from Hashem, Eglon stands, he rises up to receive this message. Ehud, the shofet, uses the opportunity to kill him. But when the Ribbono Shel Olam sees that he stands for the sake of receiving this message from Hashem, the Ribbono Shel Olam swore that one day he would have future descendants who would be kings over the Jews. So perhaps prophetically, or his Elimelech's neshama knows that there's kings from the Jews who are destined to come from Eglon Melech Moav, and so he goes to Moav, since his name is Elimelech, Eli Melech, because he feels responsibility to facilitate and cultivate that. In fact, Elimelech's plan worked, maybe not in the way he intended, but it did work because Rus, the daughter of Eglon, does in fact mother Ovid, who is the father of Yishai, who was the father of David, Shlomo, and all the kings until Mashiach. Perhaps for this reason, among others, the Balaturim compares to Amram, the father of Moshe Rabbeinu. In the beginning of the story of Rus, Naomi, Rus, and Orpah all head back to Eretz Yisrael, bereft of their husbands, and in Naomi's case, bereft of her two sons as well. Naomi works hard to convince Rus and Orpah to return to Eretz Yisrael. She's successful with Orpah, but fails with Rus. And here we find some very, very interesting commentary. Because in the beginning, Orpah pledges, she promises that she's going to stay with Naomi and go back to Eretz Yisrael. She tells Naomi, I'm coming back to your people with you. But then as Naomi convinces her, Batishak Orpah lachamoisa, Orpah kisses her mother-in-law and leaves. Rus dovkaba, only Rus remains with her mother-in-law. As Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and bid her farewell, a voice came out of heaven and said, Yovoyu b'nei hanashuka, v'yiplu b'dei b'nei hadavuka. The descendants of the one who kissed will fall in the hands of the descendants of the one who cleaved. Orpah's descendants were destined to fall in the hands of Rus's descendants. This refers to, number one, David's victory over Goliath. Goliath, the son of Orpah, David, the descendant of Rus. David kills Goliath in fulfillment of Hashem's statement that the descendants of those who kissed will fall in the hands of the descendants of those who cleaved. It wasn't just Goliath who was killed. It was his brother Yishvi Benoiv as well as Orpah herself, who was also eventually killed by David and his men and his nephew Avishai. In a fascinating story that the Gemara relates in Sanhedrin, Avishai and David kill Goliath's brother Yishvi Benoiv, as well as Orpah herself, in fulfillment of this promise of Hashem. The night that Orpah departs from her mother-in-law Naomi and her sister Rus, the Medrash tells us was a night of great spiritual descent for Orpah. She defiled herself with 100 goyim. She's promiscuous with 100 goyim, as well even as one dog. In fact, when David eventually faces Goliath actually sees David coming to greet him with stones. David says to him, do you think I'm a dog that you come to me with stones? And the reason the Medrash explains why Goliath's head goes there, thinking of himself as being perceived as a dog, is because in his own conception, there was Zera Kelev, there was seed of a dog. So Orpah has a terrible spiritual descent. And yet, number 9, the Medrash says something amazing. The Medrash says that it was in the zechus of the 4 tears that Orpah shed before she left Naomi that she merited to have 4 sons who were these Giborim, who were these giants. And it was in the zechus of the 40 steps that Orpah took together with her mother-in-law Naomi on the way back to Eretz Yisrael that she merited that her son Goliath would taunt the Jews for 40 days. It's very puzzling Medrash. In the zechus of her tears, she merited to have 4 sons who were anti-Semites and wanted to bloodthirsty attempted Jew killers. in the zchus of the 40 steps that she took with her mother-in-law Naomi on the way back to Eretz Yisrael. She merited that her son Goliath should taunt the Jews and scare them for 40 days, disrupt them from fulfilling mitzvahs, from saying Kriya Shema, blaspheme the Rabbeinu Shalom, curse the Jews, challenge them and terrorize the Jewish people. What kind of a zchus is that? I read a beautiful insight on this. The purpose of the entire writing of Megilas Rus, why was it even written? It was written by Shmuel Hanavi as an eternal testament to the kashrus of David. As we'll discuss, please God, in the upcoming shiurim, David's kashrus, David's kosher status as a Jew was challenged for centuries because of the law, because of the fact that he comes from Rus, who came from Moav. Shmuel Hanavi writes Megilas Rus as an eternal testament to his kosher status because he became David Melech Yisrael. But how actually does he become Melech Yisrael? How does this actually happen? It happens because he defeats, through his defeat in Goliath. It happens through him slaying Goliath. That's when he gets noticed by all the Jewish people. Even Shaul HaMelech himself promised that whoever killed Goliath will take his own daughter's hand in marriage. It seems that in order for David to become king, there needs to be a Goliath whom David can defeat. Perhaps in a spiritual sense, when Orpah kisses her mother-in-law and leaves her, and then defiles herself so, it was because she knew that a Goliath needed to be produced in order for David to slay him and then rise to fame. Maybe when Orpah tells Naomi, Ki itoch noshuv la'amech, we will return with you to your people. Maybe she didn't go back on her word when she kissed her and ran away. Maybe she understood that in order for this, the plan of the Rabbeinu Shalom to materialize here and for David HaMelech to rise to fame, she had her own part to play in this. She needed to produce a Goliath whom David could kill to show the Jewish people that he was the real Mashiach of Hashem and the real king to be destined for the Jews. Perhaps this is a limud zchus even on Orpah herself, and why the Medrash says that she was rewarded for the tears she shed and the steps that she took. I do want to add that this Medrash that says that Goliath was conceived the night that Orpah leaves Naomi from her cohabitation with 100 goyim and a dog, not clearly, but perhaps is in disagreement with a Medrash that says that Goliath's father was actually Shimshon himself, and that Orpah went to Shimshon in order to conceive of Goliath, in which case we would apply the same idea to Orpah and Shimshon, who conceived Goliath l'shem shamayim, for the sake of producing Goliath who would be slayed by David. Rus comes from Egloin Melech Moav, as I mentioned before. The nation of Moav comes from that famous relationship between Lot and his two daughters. In Gemara Nozer, the Gemara says something astounding about the two daughters of Lot. The Gemara says that the daughters of Lot, one should learn from the daughters of Lot, to precede, to rush to do a dvar mitzvah, because in the zchus of the fact that the older daughter of Lot is with her father Lot one night before the younger daughter, the Bechira goes one night before the Tzira, she merits to have 4 generations of kings and prophets among the Jews: Ovid, Yishai, David, and Shlomo. Shlomo marries a woman called Naomi, who's a descendant of Ammon. They have a son called Rehoboam, who is the future, from whom comes all future kings of the Jewish people, which means that from Shlomo, from Rehoboam and on, all the Jewish kings come from both Ammon and Moav. Shlomo from Moav, his wife Naomi from Ammon. But until that point, Ovid, Yishai, David, and Shlomo, it was only from Moav and not from Ammon. This is in the schus, says the Medrash, of the fact that the older daughter of Lot did a dvar mitzvah beforehand, which means that the Torah wants us, the Torah is challenging us to understand the story of Lot and his two daughters. His two daughters meant it l'shem shamayim. In fact, when the Malachim rescue Lot from Sodom together with his two daughters, the Malachim tell Lot, "Kum kachas ishtacha, take your wife, v'shtei b'noisecha hanimtzois, and your two daughters who are here, and take them out." Rashi in Chumash says there's a medrash on the word hanimtzois, but Rashi doesn't tell us what that medrash is. The Medrash is that the Malachim told Lot that his two daughters were being saved, not in their own schus, but in the schus of descendants that would come from them. Rus, Oved, Yishai, David, Shloimeh, Melech HaMashiach. And so the two daughters in the cave know that their zechus is dependent upon them producing these kings for the Jewish people. There's limud zechus, there's justification here. There's a positive perspective even on the daughters of Lot. I mentioned before the Balaturim says that the words Vayelech Ish appears in two places. By Amram and by Elimelech. By Amram, the Gemara says, Vayelech Ish, a man went, Holach batzas bitoy. He followed the advice of his daughter Miriam, who told him to get remarried and that he would have Goyal and Shel Yisrael, Moshiach and Shel Yisrael, the Jewish Redeemer. Perhaps it can be applied to Elimelech as well, who also went, about him also the Torah says, Vayelech Ish, Holach batzas b'noisav. He went by the eitzah of the counsel of his daughter. Whose daughter? The daughters of Lot, who can see into the future, that they will have descendants who will be David, Shloimeh, and Melech HaMashiach. In fact, the Kabbalists tell us, Rus is actually a Gilgul, is actually a reincarnation of the older daughter of Lot. End of segment 1.